All right, so right away with this new administration, they did something pretty major with these executive orders.
Yeah.
14148 and 14174 specifically.
Right.
Signed January 20th and 21st of 2025.
Right.
And, new presidents often use these to kind of signal their priorities, right?
Yeah.
But this time it feels a little different, doesn't it?
It really does. Executive Order 14148, especially because that one is a sweeping move.
Yeah.
It revokes 82 previous executive orders and several presidential memoranda.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, we're talking a massive amount of policy just being completely overturned very quickly.
Yeah, it's like someone walked into a museum and just started taking down all the paintings.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin to unpack this?
Well, I think the opening lines of 14148 kind of give us a pretty clear indication of this new administration's stance.
Okay.
It says, and I quote, "The previous administration has embedded deeply unpopular, inflationary, illegal, and radical practices within every agency and office of the federal government."
Whoa. Okay, they're not mincing words.
No, they are not.
So what exactly are these radical practices?
Well, the order itself calls out policies related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, often shortened to DEI.
Right, DEI, yeah.
Along with immigration and climate change.
Okay.
So it seems like these are the key areas where they want to make a dramatic shift.
Okay, so let's get into some specifics because this executive order 14148 lists a ton of revoked orders.
It does.
I was looking through it earlier, and there are a few that really jumped out at me, like Executive Order 13985, which was all about advancing racial equity in things like federal programs and contracting.
Yeah, and that one was pretty controversial. I mean, it aimed to, address systemic disparities, but critics argued that it actually led to reverse discrimination.
Oh, right.
So now with its revocation, it really does raise a lot of questions.
Yeah, like what happens to existing initiatives under that order?
All right, what happens to are they going to come up with a new approach to tackling racial disparities?
And then there's Executive Order 14010, which focused on addressing the root causes of migration from Central America.
Right.
Revoking that seems to suggest a major change in how this administration is going to approach immigration.
Absolutely. And then there's Executive Order 42075,
Okay.
which focused on advancing equality for LGBTQ plus individuals.
Right.
And this one protected them from discrimination in areas like healthcare, housing, education.
Yeah.
Now, with its revocation, many are worried about a potential rollback of these protections.
Yeah, it's a lot to process. But what I find really interesting is that this order doesn't just revoke these policies.
Yeah.
It actually instructs federal agencies to take specific actions.
You're right. Section 3 of the order is key here.
Okay.
It mandates that agencies immediately stop implementing what it calls DEI ideology.
Okay.
That's a pretty loaded term.
It is, yeah.
But it also requires agencies to review all actions they've taken based on these revoked orders and to propose either further rescissions or replacements for those actions.
So it's not just hitting the brakes. It's like turning the car around and going in a totally different direction.
Exactly. And to add another layer to this, the order tasks the National Security Advisor with reviewing all national security memoranda issued by the previous administration.
Okay, so those aren't legally binding in the same way executive orders are they?
No, they're not. But they still guide policy and action within the national security apparatus.
Oh, I see.
So this review signals a potential shift in national security priorities as well.
Wow, I hadn't even considered that angle.
Yeah.
This is getting really interesting. So they're reviewing everything, but what happens next? What might these replacements look like?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, we'll have to see how different agencies interpret these instructions.
Yeah.
Some might opt for a complete overhaul, while others might make more subtle adjustments. So this is definitely something to watch closely because it could have significant ramifications for various sectors.
Okay, so we've got this massive shakeup with Executive Order 14148, but you mentioned there was another one, right? 174.
Yes, and this one's much more targeted. It specifically revokes 2 executive orders from 2021 that dealt with COVID-19 mandates.
You mean the ones that mandated vaccines and safety protocols for federal employees and contractors?
Exactly. Executive Order 40042, which focused on safety protocols for federal contractors.
Right.
And Executive Order 14043, which mandated vaccinations for federal employees.
Okay.
And these were controversial measures, of course, and their revocation marks a pretty significant shift in federal COVID-19 policies.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, we're talking about potentially millions of workers now impacted by this change.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, what does this signal about the new administration's approach to the pandemic at the federal level?
Yeah, it's a big question. Revoking these mandates suggests a move towards a more hands-off approach, leaving these decisions up to individuals and private businesses rather than mandating them from the federal level.
So this is all a lot to take in, and I'm sure our listeners are already thinking about how these changes might affect their own lives.
You're right, and I think that's what's so fascinating about these early moves by the new administration.
Yeah.
They're not just abstract policy shifts happening in Washington. They have the potential to impact all of us in very real ways.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, laying out the basics of these two executive orders, but I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, absolutely.
What else should we be paying attention to as this story unfolds?
That's a great question, and that's exactly what we'll be exploring further in the next part of this deep dive. We'll go beyond the headlines, dig into the potential consequences of these revocations, and analyze what they tell us about the direction of this new administration. It's fascinating, the contrast between the broad sweep of 14148 and then the laser focus of 14174.
Right.
It suggests a very strategic approach, like they wanted to tackle a wide range of issues with the first one and then use the second to make a very pointed statement on COVID.
Yeah, it's like they used a bulldozer to clear the ground with that first one,
Yeah.
and then they brought out a scalpel for some very specific incisions.
Exactly. And even the language used in both is very telling.
Oh, yeah?
Remember that phrase, deeply unpopular, inflationary, illegal, and radical practices from 14148?
Yeah.
That's not just typical bureaucratic language.
Right.
It's them deliberately framing the previous administration's actions in a very negative light.
Yeah, it definitely sets a combative tone, and it makes you wonder how the public will react to these changes. Are we going to see pushback from people who supported the previous administration's policies?
Oh, absolutely. I think we're already seeing strong reactions from various groups.
Yeah.
Some are praising the new administration for taking what they're calling decisive action,
Uh-huh.
while others are condemning these moves as, harmful and discriminatory.
Right.
And this is especially true when it comes to rolling back the DEI initiatives and the protections for LGBTQI plus individuals.
So it sounds like we're in for a pretty bumpy ride. I mean, we've seen the executive orders, but what about the actual implementation of them? What are the practical next steps here?
That's the big question, isn't it? The devil is always in the details.
Always.
We need to see how agencies are going to interpret these orders and translate them into concrete actions. Like, what specific guidelines will they issue?
Right.
What programs are going to be revised or even eliminated?
Yeah.
What new policies will they propose? All of this is going to take time to unfold.
And of course, we can expect legal challenges to some of these revocations, right?
Absolutely. Anyone who feels like their rights are being infringed upon or that these actions exceed the administration's authority are likely going to turn to the courts to try and get some recourse.
Yeah.
So alongside the agency implementation, we can anticipate a wave of litigation challenging the legality of these orders, and that could drag things out even further, create uncertainty, and potentially even conflicting interpretations across different jurisdictions.
Yeah. It feels like we're at a turning point. The new administration is making bold moves to reshape the federal government. But these changes are not happening in a vacuum.
No.
They're going to be met with resistance, debate, legal battles. It's going to be fascinating to see how this all plays out.
Precisely. These executive orders are just the opening moves in what's likely to be a long and complex process of policy shifts and legal challenges. And the effects of these revocations will extend far beyond Washington. They have the potential to touch every aspect of American life, from workplaces and schools to healthcare and the environment.
This brings us to a crucial question. What does all of this mean for our listener, the person on the other side of these microphones?
That's the key question, isn't it? If we
Right.
connect these executive orders to the bigger picture, it seems like they're signaling a potential sea change in everything from, workplace regulations and healthcare to environmental policy and national security.
Wow.
These changes aren't just abstract political maneuverings. They're going to affect people's lives in very concrete ways.
Yeah. It's a lot to absorb. I'm already thinking about how these changes might affect my own life, my work, my community.
And that's exactly the right mindset, to have these revocations have the potential to touch every corner of American life, whether you're a federal employee, a contractor, a business owner, or just a concerned citizen.
Yeah.
It's crucial to stay informed about these developments and understand how they might affect you personally.
So where do we go from here? What should our listeners be paying attention to in the coming weeks and months?
I'd say pay close attention to how these executive orders are actually implemented, what specific actions are different agencies taking, what new policies or regulations are being proposed, and what kind of legal challenges are emerging.
Okay.
We're just at the beginning of what's going to be a long and complex process of change.
It's like we're watching the beginning of this huge domino effect.
Yeah.
These initial executive orders are just the first pieces to fall, and who knows how far-reaching the consequences will be.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. Think about it. You have 82 executive orders being revoked, each one touching on all these different policies and impacting various agencies and sectors.
Yeah.
Then you have the COVID-19 mandate revocations that are potentially affecting millions of workers
Right.
and reshaping the federal government's entire approach to public health. So it's a chain reaction, and we're only seeing the first ripples right now.
So what does this mean for, say, someone working in a field like education or healthcare? Could these revocations trickle down to affect their daily work?
Oh, absolutely. For instance, the revocation of Executive Order 13985.
The one focusing on racial equity.
Yeah, exactly. That could have significant implications for schools and universities.
How so?
While funding allocations for programs that are aimed at supporting underserved communities, those might be revised or even eliminated.
Oh, wow.
We could also see a shift in admissions policies and curriculum development.
And in healthcare?
Yeah, the impact could be just as significant. Revoking the order on LGBTQI plus equality could lead to changes in healthcare access and insurance coverage for that community. It could also affect medical research and the development of treatments for specific health concerns.
I'd see.
And then the revocation of the COVID-19 mandates.
Right.
That could also impact healthcare providers and facilities, leaving them to kind of navigate the pandemic landscape with much less federal oversight.
It sounds like we're talking about potential changes to everything from hiring practices and funding to regulations and enforcement.
Exactly. And the ripple effects won't stop there. We could see changes in environmental regulations, labor laws, national security protocols.
Wow.
It's really a whole of government shift with the potential to impact every single facet of American life.
So what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember from all of this?
Stay engaged. Stay informed. Don't
Right.
just read the headlines. Dig a little deeper. Understand the nuances of these executive orders.
Uh-huh.
And really think about the potential consequences for your own life, your community, and the issues that you care about.
It's not just about knowing what's happening in Washington. It's about understanding how those decisions in Washington translate into changes in your own backyard.
Precisely. And it's about being prepared to participate in the conversation because these policy shifts will spark debate, disagreement,
For sure.
and likely further legal challenges. So it's crucial to stay informed so you can make your voice heard and contribute to shaping the future direction of these policies.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure our listeners are feeling the same way. It's clear this new administration is not shying away from making big changes, and it's up to all of us to stay informed and engaged as these changes unfold.
Absolutely. The dominoes have started to fall, and it's going to be fascinating and likely challenging to see where they land.